last call. Anybody who wants a glass of wine needs to run into the other room right now and get it. Okay? Is anybody running in? Okay. Okay, so just a second and we'll start. You ready up there? Okay. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming here instead of planting yourself in front of the television waiting for Celtics. Yeah, it's 8:30. You can all get up and run at about 8:15, so they're going to win anyway, so don't worry about it. A few announcements before we get going. We do have more brick applications in the other room if you are interested. You want to commemorate yourself, your friends, people you don't like particularly, whatever. We have bricks, they're $75 a piece, $120 for two, to commemorate. And we put it in our little walkway out front. So I know I'm going to forget some stuff, but I want to thank Tick Homes for coming once again to sell books. This particular book is excellent, and I recommend that you get it. It's been praised by a lot of critics as being one of the better ship and shipwreck books out there. So next week we have Falmouth Museum President Tamsin George, who will relate the award-winning true account of Allegiance, the life and times of William Eustace. In his own time, William Eustace didn't need any introduction. He was he studied medicine under Joseph Warren. He defeated John Quincy Adams for Congress. He was governor of Massachusetts, and he was an ambassador and held cabinet positions under James Madison. But the name was sort of lost to history. And Tamsin George, we hope, will bring it back to life. Tonight's program is sponsored by Carrie Burrs, who's here. Thank you very much, Carrie. And by Jeff and Nancy Belzekian. I haven't seen them, but if they are not here, let's clap for them anyway. And I also want to thank Susan Swiger, who brought us some goodies to eat. So before you run off to see the Celtics, you'll have to grab a glass of wine and some cake. So the speaker tonight is no stranger to Tales of Cape Cod. Eric J. Dolin has been a guest speaker here several times. American Heritage calls him one of the finest writers about ships and the sea. He is the author of 16 books, including Leviathan, which I can never pronounce, The History of Whaling in America, which was chosen as one of the best nonfiction books of 2007 by the Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe. And he also won the 2007 John Lyman Award for U.S. Maritime History. His most recent book, Before Left for Dead, is Rebels at Sea. Also, it's on sale. Privateering in the American Revolution, which was awarded the Francis Tavern Museum Book Award and the Samuel Eliot Morrison Book Award for Naval History. So we are very lucky to have both books available for you. Before Rebels came A Furious Sky, Eric was here for that lecture, which was excellent. That's the 500-year history of America's hurricanes, which was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize and was chosen as one of the 50 notable books of nonfiction of the year by the Washington Post, and is one of the best science and technology books of 2020 by the Library Journal and Book List. Left for Dead, the subject for this evening's talk, has also received its share of accolades and as you will see, is based on a fascinating true story. I'd like to introduce Mr. Dolin.
Thanks, Ann, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I am a fair weather Celtics fan. I only watch the finals of sports. I used to play a lot of sports, but I'm taping it. When I drive home tonight, I'm not going to listen to the radio, so I don't know what's going to happen. But I've had some bad luck with Boston teams and book talks. I once gave a book talk on the night that the Red Sox won the World Series, and I gave another talk in the afternoon, or no, it was the evening, on a Sunday when the Patriots were in the Super Bowl. So I'm glad that you showed up. So thank you very much, and thanks to whomever sponsored my coming here tonight. Every time I've been, as you know, I've been here 3 times. I drove around Barnstable a little bit before getting here. It's just a beautiful community, and I have a closer connection to Barnstable now because my dentist's father-in-law lives someplace around here. He's 95 years old, and she and her husband come here every weekend, and they rave about Barnstable, so it must be a very nice place to live. Anyway, Left 4 Dead is a true story of a wild and fateful encounter between an American sailing vessel, a shipwrecked British brig, and a British warship that meet on the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. Yeah, great, thank you. Fraught with misunderstandings and mistrust, the incident left 3 British sailors and 2 Americans, including the captain of the sealing vessel, Charles H. Barnard, stranded, intentionally marooned on the islands for 18 months. It is a tale involving British and Americans meeting under the most stressful of circumstances in a time of war. Kindness and compassion, drunkenness, the birth of a child, treachery, greed, lying, a hostile takeover, stellar leadership, ingenuity, severe privation, the great value of a good dog, perseverance, endurance, threats, bullying, banishment, a perilous 1,200-mile journey in a 17-and-a-half-foot boat, an improbable rescue mission in a rickety ship, and legal battles over a dubious and disgraceful wartime prize. And I have to tell you, that's an actual sentence from the book. My wife and my editor wanted me to shorten it, but I really like it, and it sort of captures what's in the book. So the centerpiece for the book is the extremely cold and windy Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands, during the winter months, the average temperature is 36 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, it soars to 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average wind speed in the Falklands year-round is 18 miles per hour. And there wasn't a single tree on all of these islands back then, so there's no shielding. So an 18-mile-an-hour wind speed with a 36-degree temperature puts you in the upper 20s, so it's very cold and windy indeed. It's a sprawling archipelago of more than 700 islands, and many of the images, the color images that you're going to see tonight of the Falklands were taken by a photographer who grew up in the Falklands on New Island, a woman named Georgina Strange, and the entire insert in the book, all color images, are images taken by Georgina. She's just a fascinating person and an excellent photographer. So the Falklands are located roughly 300 miles from the eastern coast of South America, and the Falklands have a stark beauty. The rugged landscape is undeniably spectacular and a little strange. And if you could see this picture up close, you see all the white stuff on the rocks? What do you think that is? Guano. Oh, you guys are really smart. I'm going to stop asking questions. No, it's guano from black-browed albatrosses. The Falklands is the location in the world that has the largest concentration of that species, 700,000 pairs, and they obviously go to the bathroom on the rocks. This is settlement rookery in a storm. And this is one of my favorite images of the Falklands taken by Georgina. It just gives you a sense of the alien nature of the environment. But I come from Marblehead, and I gave a talk the other day, and when I put this up, I said, this is sort of what Marblehead looks like, right? No? No, you don't know. No, it's sort of like Barnstable, no. But anyway, the flora, such as this sea cabbage and this wild celery, as well as the fauna, like this barn owl, which actually graces a postage stamp from the Falklands, are amazing. But the most important animals on the Falklands with regards to this book are the seals, the fur seals and the sea lions. Charles Barnard and his crew of 12 men, along with his trusty dog Scent, left New York Harbor and headed to the Falklands on a 73-foot-long brig named the Nanina. And they left on April 12th of 1812, and they were hoping to strike it rich in the Falklands by gathering a hold full of seal skins. And those seal skins would be sold in China, in Canton, China, or what we now call Guangzhou, China. And to give you a sense of how large this industry was at the time, you're all probably very familiar with the whaling industry, being here on the Cape. Now, sealing was not nearly as big as the whaling industry, but between the late 1700s and about 1815, somewhere in the order of 2.5 million to 3.5 million seals were slaughtered in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean. Their pelts were stripped off, and most of them were sent to China, where they were sold for between 35 cents a piece and $5. Now, $5 in the beginning of the 1800s was a fair amount of money, so when you multiply that, you realize that this was an industry that was big enough to sustain fleets of scores of ships, many of them coming from the United States. But it wasn't only the seal skins that they were after. They also wanted to kill elephant seals. And that's because these elephant seals, as you can see, they are padded with a lot of blubber. And when you cut that blubber off and you pitch it into a tripod, just like whalers used to do with whale blubber, and you melt it down, you get an oil that is second only in value and illumination potential to spermaceti oil. So it was quite valuable. And I have to add something about the name elephant seal. It is not because of the size of the animal, the gargantuan nature of the animal. It's because when the Westerners from Europe first saw the elephant seal, they saw that proboscis, and it reminded them of the trunk of an elephant. Now, this book got reviewed in the Washington Post, and the reviewer, nice review, but he made 3 errors, factual errors. And one of them, he said that elephant seals are named that way because they're huge. And some readers who were smart knew better, and I looked in the comments, and a couple of readers basically assumed that I wrote that in my book, which I didn't, because I have the accurate information in the book, and they basically wrote off the entire book because of that factual problem. So I actually did something I've never done before. I responded to a commenter, and I said, no, I did not say that. The reviewer said that. So maybe I got one more sale. I don't think so. I don't know. But anyway, it's a good idea not to look at your reviews. I've come to learn that. But anyway, this is one of the maps that I had created for the book. There are 3 maps, 2 small maps of islands, and then there's one huge end paper map which helps orient you, and you can follow what's happening in the book. But the Nanina arrived at New Island on September 8th of 1812, and they moored in Hooker's Harbor there, shown sort of in the center of the island. Now, Barnard and his men, they took a great chance leaving New York in April of 1812 because it was right as an embargo was being placed on all shipping in advance of the expected outbreak of the War of 1812. It was later called the War of 1812. And the reason they have an embargo before hostilities break out is to give ships that are at sea enough time to come back. It was going to be a 60 or 90-day embargo. But Charles Barnard and the people that owned the Nanina knew that this embargo was probably coming down, and they didn't want to lose the opportunity to have this profitable voyage. So they snuck out right as the embargo was launched and went down to the Falklands, and they knew they were running a risk, and that risk came to bear at the beginning of 1813 in January. An American whale ship named the Hope arrived in the Falkland Islands and told Barnard that the War of 1812 had indeed begun the previous June. And in accord with the contract that Barnard and the other men on board the Nanina had signed with the owner of the ship, they were supposed to return to the nearest American port as soon as the war broke out. But they took a vote and they decided, we don't want to do that. They wanted to stay in the Falklands for another year, continue sealing, continue to hopefully make money, and they hoped that by the end of a year, the war would be over and they could travel back to the United States free of molestation by British warships. But the problem, and this is one of the early battles in the War of 1812. Oh, I should have brought a picture. For Father's Day, my wife and my daughter, I've got a son too, they bought me a painting that looks sort of like that of an old frigate that they found in an antique store. And anyway, I'm not sure why I mentioned it. It was one of the best Father's Day presents they ever gave me. So I hopefully someday I won't discover that it's a fake because it looks really old. But anyway, so when the war began, they couldn't. Let me get this thing here. Okay, they're up here. This is New Ireland, and this is part of the end paper map. They couldn't stay there because they knew that during times of war, and even times when there weren't wars, British whale ships and warships often came to New Ireland to get water and sometimes food. So they had to hide out. So they sailed all the way over here to Barnard's Harbor. And you can see Charles Barnard developed one of the first maps of the Falklands. And he was a little bit of an arrogant guy. He named a lot of things after himself. Barnard's Island, Barnard's Harbor. So anyway, they bring the Nanina over here and they settle in for a year's worth of sealing. Now, they assumed that they were the only people on the islands at that time, and it was true for a while. But in April 1813, they discovered that they weren't alone. Months earlier, on December 4th, 1812, the 193-ton brig Isabella, British brig, left from Port Jackson Harbor in the British penal colony of New South Wales, which you know today as Sydney Harbor and Australia, but it was started as a penal colony. And the brig's destination was London. They were going to go around Cape Horn and they were supposed to go all the way to London. In addition to a cargo of seal skins, whale oil, and mother of pearl shells, the Isabella had on board 54 people, including 34 passengers. 14 of them were armed Royal Marines who were going home for some rest and relaxation. And there were also 10 who were pardoned convicts who had served their time and were going back home. And among those 10 convicts were 4 former female prostitutes. And they play a role in the book. To get the full role, you have to read the book, though. But anyway, after nearly crashing into an island south of New Zealand and barely surviving a tempestuous sail around the notorious Cape Horn, on February 8th of 1813, the Isabella crashed onto a reef just off Eagle Island in the Falkland Islands and came to rest very close to shore. And the reason they nearly came to grief south of New Zealand and then crashed into the Falklands had everything to do with the captain of the vessel, a guy named George Hickton, who was an alcoholic from what I could determine, and he preferred to spend time down below playing cards or sharing his bed with one of the female prostitutes rather than sailing the ship. And fortunately, they avoided a complete wreck off of New Zealand because there was another captain of a ship on board, and he took the reins, but he wasn't fast enough when they were off the Falklands. And they crashed, this is the end paper map, they crashed into Eagle Island, which is right here. Remember, they're way over here, sealing. And, okay. Miraculously, all on board, this is Eagle Island, all the people on board made it ashore. Now, Eagle Island is about 7 miles long and about 3 to 4 miles wide. Today, it's owned by 2 people, Chris and Lindsay May. They live there entirely alone, with the exception of 60,000 sheep that they own. And their son, he owns a neighboring island, but he's a piker when it comes to sheep because he only has 30,000 sheep. So there are a lot more sheep in the Falkland Islands than there are people. There are only about 5,500 people there now, a lot more sheep. And Chris was very helpful to me in putting together this book, especially figuring out exactly where the crash occurred. And you'll see some of the pictures later. Actually, this next picture was provided by Chris. This is the anchor, and it's pretty long. It's about 12 feet long, and if you had both flukes, it'd be about 7 feet across. So it's a pretty sizable anchor, and that picture was taken just about a year ago, so it's still out there. And everybody came ashore, and they created a new settlement that they dubbed New Providence. Now, a few weeks later, the survivors sent off 6 men, one of whom used to be a captain of British transport vessels, so he knew how to sail a ship. They sent off 6 men in a 17.5-foot boat that had been slightly modified. They raised the sides about 6 inches, and they put some decking so they could sleep beneath the main plank. And they had 2 goals in mind, sequential goals. Their first direction was to sail around the Falklands looking for what they hoped would be either a Spanish or a British settlement. They didn't know that about a year before the year before the War of 1812 broke out, the Spanish settlement was disbanded, and the British had left sometime before that. So they sailed around the Falklands. They nearly capsized or crashed the small boat a couple of times. They didn't find anybody, and then that went to phase 2. If they didn't find anybody, they were supposed to sail 1,200 miles up here to Montevideo, part of early Uruguay, and or to Buenos Aires. They actually ultimately went to Buenos Aires, and they made it. They almost sank once, and you can read about that in the book. Anyway, when they got to Buenos Aires, they met with the captain of the British ship, the HMS Nereus, and the captain's name was Peter Heywood. And if any of you have read any books about the mutiny on the Bounty, that name will sound familiar because he was, according to Bligh, one of the mutineers. He claims he wasn't. He actually made it back to England. He was put on trial. He was going to be put to death, but then his sentence was commuted, and he was reinstated in the Navy, and now he was in Buenos Aires, and he was the head of the station there and the head of the HMS Nereus. So he had a lot of experience with misfortune, and when he heard about what had happened to the castaways, he immediately wanted to launch a rescue mission. And he did. He sent the HMS Nancy, headed by a guy named William Peter Duranda, down to the Falklands to rescue all of the British castaways. Now, in the meantime, this is about a month or so elapsed, a little bit more. In the meantime, things had really taken a dramatic turn back in the Falklands. In early April of 1813, Barnard and a few of his men were over here sealing. They had taken something called the Young Nanina, which is a shallop or a smaller vessel attached to the Nanina. They actually built it when they got down to the Falklands. So the Nanina was the mother ship that was moored in one place. They took down the rigging and the sails. The young Nanina, a shallop, maybe 30 feet long, 25 feet long, that's what they would take all around the islands to kill the seals and the sea elephants and bring stuff back to the Nina. So they were here doing some sealing, and all of a sudden they saw smoke rising from Eagle Island, and they went to investigate. And upon investigating, they came upon the Newtown Providence camp and the castaways of the Isabella. Now, despite the fact that America and Britain were at war, something that Barnard clearly knew, he offered the British castaways a deal. He basically said, I will use the Nanina to take all of you to South America so you can catch a ship to London. I will forego the rest of my sealing trip, but in exchange, I want from you to get the cargo that's in the Isabella and salvage rights to any of the stuff that they could pull off of the wreck, minus personal effects. So people were allowed to keep their personal effects. Now, he thought that this was a fair deal because they were foregoing the rest of their trip, so they were going to lose money. And the British thought this was great, and they were very thankful that the Americans were offering them this opportunity. But in offering them this opportunity, Barnard quickly realized something. The British did not know that the war had broken out yet. And he decided, and there were some other, you have to read why, there are actually some other captains of ships on board the Nanina. It was a very interesting cast of characters. But they all got together and they said, we've got to tell these British castaways that the war has begun and that we're technically enemies because they greatly outnumber us. 14 of them are armed Marines. If they find out about it later, they're going to get really pissed off and they may do something bad. So we need to tell them up front. And they did. And when they told them, they took another vote, the British castaways, and all of them, with the exception of a couple really nasty pieces of work, said, fine, the Americans are doing the right thing, they're helping us out, I don't care that we're enemies, this is not a situation that's part of the war right now, this is a humanitarian mission. So everything was supposedly set, leaving some of his men behind on Eagle Island. Barnard took the young Nanina and he sailed all the way back to Barnard's Harbor. Actually, it was more complicated than that because it was really bad weather. And this area here from Cape Meredith all the way up to Cape Orford is called an iron-bound shore. At least that's what Charles Barnard dubbed it. And that's because this entire way, there's not a single beach or place to pull your boat up. It's sheer cliffs. And there was really bad weather, so it's very dangerous. So what they had hoped, they wanted to sail around it, but it was difficult because of the weather. So they actually stopped here, and Barnard and most of the people hiked 13 miles over to Barnard's Harbor, and then Barnard, with a couple of his men that were very good mariners, took a boat around here and then grabbed the young Nanina and brought it back. So it was a very circuitous trip, and there were a couple of children on the Isabella and a couple of children that were on that ship. So on May 3rd, 1813, they finally got reunited. The British helped the Americans put the Nanina to rights, raise the sails, get the rigging back in order, the spars, so that they could go back to Eagle Island and pick up the rest of the British and then leave the Falklands with them. Now, at that very same moment, and keep in mind that nobody, the British castaways, neither the British castaways nor the Americans knew what happened to that 17.5-foot boat that went off on a rescue mission. Well, at that very moment when Barnard is here with many of the British getting ready, Commander Duranda and the HMS Nancy arrive at Eagle Island. And that really was a dramatic alteration to the Americans and the Britons' plans. Duranda said, I don't care if the Americans were doing the right thing. I don't care about this agreement that you voted on and that they were going to help save the castaways. It is war, and that American ship is a prize of war, and all of those Americans are going to be prisoners of war. And despite the fact that the Americans had done so much so far for the British castaways, at least in theory, none of the castaways stood up to Duranda. And a number of them wrote later that they felt horrible about what was happening to the Americans, but nobody said anything to Duranda. So first to come back to Eagle Island was the young Nanina. And when it arrived in Jack's Harbor, Duranda immediately took it as a prize, placed all the Americans under arrest, essentially. And days turned into weeks, and the Nanina failed to arrive. The people who came on the young Nanina told Duranda that the Nanina was right behind them. But this is, again, about a bad weather. And Duranda started to worry. He thought that his prize ship had foundered and sank somewhere in the Falkland Islands. Well, it didn't sink, but something quite troubling had occurred. The atrocious weather and the adverse winds kept the Nanina from sailing around the Capes back to the Eagle Island for some time and forced Barnard to pull into Coffin's Harbor, or Ship Harbor right here. But the weather continued to be very bad, and on June 3rd, Barnard had a meeting with this guy, Robert Dury. He was the guy who was in charge of the 14 Royal Marines. And Barnard told him, the weather is just too bad to risk the Nanina continuing on. Let's stay here for a couple of weeks until the weather breaks. Then we'll go to Eagle Island and pick up the rest of the castaways. Now, Dury agreed that that was a great idea, and the plan was presented to everybody on board, and everybody voted, except for one or two, everybody voted in favor of it, and they moored. This was a little too exposed, so they warped around, they came around here, and they moored right in here, and they had 3 anchors out, because the wind was really blowing. Now, Dury, it's a funny story, Captain Robert Dury, he has descendants who helped me a little bit with this book. They provided that image, but they know the story, and they know that their ancestor does not come out looking too well. And so I had this funny back and forth with the current Robert Dury. He said, "Well, I hope you're nice to my ancestor." I said, "Well, it's kind of hard. He didn't acquit himself too well in this." But I haven't heard from them yet. I don't know if they've read the book. The book doesn't officially publish in England until the 18th, which I guess is tomorrow, June 18th. So we'll see. It's got to be tough if you have ancestors who don't live up to your ideal of what you would want them to be. Also, he became Dury when he came. This is a side story, but when Dury came back after the end of this story, he got an honorary title. So I asked his descendant. I said, "Oh, do you have a big estate in England?" He goes, "No, we have the title, but no money." So maybe he doesn't feel that favorably disposed to his ancestor anyway. Okay, just over a week later, there was a break in the weather, and Barnard proposed using the small jolly boat that was on the Nanina, similar to this, to go to a neighboring island and kill some hogs and kill some geese and bring them back to everybody, who was fast running out of food. So here's another humanitarian gesture on Barnard's part to go get some food. And those hogs were there because mariners that came to the Falklands in earlier years, and when mariners went all over the world, they would often seed islands that didn't have a good source of food with hogs, chickens, rabbits, all sorts of things. And mariners that came to the Falklands in the decades leading up to when this event takes place had brought hogs there, and they had populated a few of the islands. So, minutes after proposing this trip to the neighboring island, all the British rush forward and they say, "We can't. We've got to go right to Eagle Island right now, right away." Barnard calmed him down, said, "Listen, I'm just going to go for this hunt for a day or two. I'm going to bring back food. We need food, and then we'll leave immediately." So they calmed down and they dropped their demand. Believing that things were under control, Barnard asked for volunteers to come with him on this hunt. 1 American volunteered, and 3 British sailors. And on June 11th, they hopped into this boat and they went to the neighboring island. They brought virtually nothing with them except for their dog, Barnard's dog, Scent, and a couple of clubs, a couple of knives, 1 lance, and a little bit of food, but nothing else. On June 13th, the British, this is after the hunting party left, on June 13th, the British renewed their demand that the Americans leave right away, that the Nanina leave right away and go to Eagle Island. Now, on board the Nanina was a guy named Valentine Barnard, who is Charles Barnard's father. He was 63 years old. He had 2 hernias. He was held together by multiple trusses and bandages, and why he was on this voyage, that's an interesting story in and of itself. But anyway, he had feelings for his son, I guess, and he said, "You can't leave now and abandon. My son's going to come back in a day or two. Let's wait, and then we'll go." And he pleaded with Captain Dury, who was the lead military guy there, to hold fast for a while, wait till the hunting party comes back. Well, far from being sympathetic to the Americans' plight, Dury sided with the rest of the British, and he said, "I see no reason why we can't leave right now." Shocked by this answer, Valentine responded, "Your Marines are under your charge, and I demand of you assistance. And if you do not assist me, I conclude that you take charge, and you shall be accountable for whatever happens." Well, unfortunately for Valentine and the missing men, Captain Robert Dury lacked a spine of steel. Over the continued objections of the Americans, the Marines prepared the Nanina for departure. And on June 14th, they were ready to set sail. One of the Americans on board knew that the British had very little knowledge of the Falkland Islands. It's a very treacherous place in the world to sail. And if you're not familiar with not only the currents, but other obstacles, both on land and underwater, you could really get into trouble fast. So one of the Americans said, I'll make you a deal. I will sail the Nanina to Eagle Island to pick up the castaways, but we have to stop off at the neighboring island, Beaver Island, which incidentally has no beavers on it. Anyway, Beaver Island, where the hunting party was, we have to stop there and pick up the hunting party, and then we'll go on. Well, the British agreed to this humanitarian detour, but when they reached Beaver Island, the British reneged on their deal. They refused to send a boat or even briefly come to anchor. All they did was fire a gun twice, wait a few minutes, and then they sailed off. Valentine pleaded with the British to do more, making clear that to leave the crew on that island, the hunting crew on that island, in the depth of a dreadfully severe winter without food, raiment, or shelter was the equivalent of a death sentence. Unmoved, the British sailed off. Can you imagine that you're on a boat, you're leaving your comrades behind, your fellow the people who came down to the Falklands to sail with you, but also you're leaving your son behind. But when you read the book, you'll find out that the relationship between the father and son was a little rocky. Anyway, but I'm sure he didn't want to leave his son behind. Now, when the Nanina arrived at Eagle Island, it came here into Jack's Harbor. And the Duranda claimed it as a prize, and the Americans became prisoners. Now, this is Jack's Harbor and Eagle Island. Now, look at that. That's not what Eagle Island looked like in the early 1800s. Remember, there are 60,000 sheep on the island now. What do sheep like to do? Eat a lot of grass. So they keep the entire island mowed. Back in the early 1800s, this grass would have been a lot taller. There's something called tussock grass, which I'll show you a picture of later, and that might be it in the foreground. I'm not 100% sure. But it can grow to be 9 feet tall. And actually, the first mariners that saw, Western mariners that saw the Falklands from afar, they thought they were palm trees. I don't know how they thought that, how cold it was, but that's what they thought. Now, the most plausible explanation for why Duranda claimed the Nanina and the young Nanina as a prize and placed all the Americans under arrest, essentially, as prisoners of war, is that he was motivated purely by the glory of capturing a prize during a time of war. And if you've read my earlier book, Rebels at Sea, or know anything about wartime procedures, when you are a ship of one country and you capture a ship of a belligerent country and you bring it back to a court of admiralty, you can have it condemned as a valid prize. And if that happens, then you get to sell the ship and its cargo and split the money from that sale. And that's what Duranda was hoping to do. He also didn't have a very illustrious naval career up to that point, and he thought that this might burnish his reputation. Now, in the coming weeks, and it was many weeks and it actually went into more than a month, the Americans on Eagle Island pleaded with Duranda to send a rescue mission from here all the way around up here to Beaver Island, about 90 miles away. Duranda kept refusing. Then finally, when he consented, all he did was send 3 men across Falkland Sound to here. They turned around and they came back, and obviously they did not get the hunting party. On July 27th, exactly 170 days after the Isabella crashed, came ashore, and 44 days since the 5-man hunting party had been left behind, the Nancy and the Nanina left the Falkland Islands. The young Nanina was being towed behind the Nanina, but soon after leaving the Falklands, the rope severed, and the young Nanina sort of drifted into the southern Atlantic Ocean, never to be seen again. Fortunately, there was nobody on board, but there was some cargo on board. Now, the people that left on the Nancy and the Nanina, they had no idea what happened to the hunting party. Nobody knew what happened to the hunting party. They could have imagined many things, but what they imagined was almost certainly not as dramatic as what actually occurred. The hunt on Beaver Island went well. When the men sailed, they killed a number of hogs and geese. And as I mentioned before, these hogs were the descendants of earlier hogs that were brought there, but pretty fearsome. Remember those tusks, pretty fearsome tusks that these hogs have. When they sailed back to New Ireland on June 14th, late in the day, what are they greeted with? Nothing. The Nanina is gone, and there's nothing there. The next morning when they search at dawn, they refuse to believe that they were barbarously deserted, as Barnard said, and they seized on another explanation. They convinced themselves that the Nanina was over at Beaver Island, but had gone to the opposite side of the island from where they were hunting. So they pushed their boat back into the water. They rowed 12 miles to Beaver Island. They went to the opposite side from where they were hunting, went into the harbor, and as Barnard later recalled, they experienced the almost insupportable anguish of neither finding the brig nor discovering any trace that she had been there. They had been cruelly abandoned at the beginnings of a Falklands winter with little to sustain them and no explanation as to why they had been left in such a horrendous predicament. On June 15th, the men latched on to one final hope. They assumed that the Nanina had gone back to Eagle Island, and they were going to sail their little boat all the way to Eagle Island. And that's what they placed their faith on. For more than a month, remember, they're here. For more than a month, well, then let me first tell you what their original goal was: to go here down to this inlet, pull up here, drag their boat across the land, go into here, and come out here and then go over to Eagle Island. That's because they too wanted to avoid the iron-bound coast. Well, for more than a month, they got turned around. They went up here, they did this, they did this. They came back to Swan Island, and they were really, really tired, but they decided to try one more time. This time, they did make it to Fagan's Inlet. They made it all the way here. Two of the men in the snow trudged to about halfway there. They saw the harbor. They knew they were in the right place. But when they came back to the boat that was waiting for them, they were so tired, they were so emaciated, they took a vote and they decided they could not continue. So they went back to Swan Island and established a rudimentary camp. Now, after the Nancy and the Nanina made it to Rio de Janeiro, after they left Eagle Island, they split up. The Nancy headed to Buenos Aires, and then Duranda left. The Nancy was in really bad shape. They basically cut it up for wood. And after that, Duranda made his way to Rio de Janeiro, where the Nanina was waiting for him. In Rio, this guy, Rear Admiral Sir Manly Dixon. I always thought that was a great name for a Rear Admiral, Manly Dixon. Anyway, he met with Duranda and the Americans, and he decided that a great injustice had occurred. He argued that Duranda should never have claimed the Nanina as a prize, nor made the Americans prisoners of war. The Americans had acted nobly, agreeing to save the castaways, and Dixon was greatly troubled by the way in which the Americans were treated and the disgraceful act of leaving the hunting party behind. So Dixon wanted to make a deal with Valentine Barnard in which Barnard would get back the Nanina and even possibly be able to sail back to the Falklands to retrieve his son and the other four men. But after days of negotiating, they couldn't come to agreement. And Dixon was so frustrated with Valentine Barnard that he threw up his hands and he said, "Fine, the Nanina is going to London, where a prize court can decide who owns this thing." And, the hunting party, they're going to have to go do whatever they do on their own. So while Valentine was negotiating with Dixon, the other Americans made their way back to the United States. They brought with them a protest that they had written in Rio de Janeiro that described all what had happened on the Falkland Islands, and it was sent to the State Department, but it was also printed in newspapers throughout the country, and it was prefaced by a paragraph that was written by the first editor that published the protest in the Hudson Bee publication in Hudson, New York, where some of the men on the Nanina came from. And I'm going to read you what this says, just because it's very dramatic. Anyway, we request the attention of the reader to the following account of the almost unparalleled ingratitude and treachery of the crew of a British ship to the crew of an American vessel. the latter having saved the lives of the former, whose vessel had been wrecked. And they, in return for this humane act, seized and made prize of the vessel and the property of their preservers. Were it not that such a nation as Britain existed, this act of treachery might be correctly styled unparalleled. But British history is full of incidents of such black ingratitude. Such conduct, even in our enemy, cannot fail to call forth the indignant feelings of every American who has a drop of patriotic blood flowing in his veins. And I apologize to those of you, I know there's at least one British expat in the back of the room that had nasty talk about those horrible British. But don't worry, every single country, you scratch the surface, there are a lot of bad things in their history. But I just love that paragraph. And keep in mind, the war was still raging, so Americans were not reconciled to their former mother country once again. Okay, when the owners of the Nina discovered what had happened, because they heard from the Americans that made their way back from Rio de Janeiro, they were really upset, but there was not much they could do. They couldn't mount a rescue mission because the war was still going on. It'd be incredibly expensive, and a lot of time had already elapsed, and nobody was convinced that the hunting party was still alive. So they didn't know what had happened to the hunting party. In fact, nobody did. And if they did know, they probably would have been amazed and impressed. This is an engraving from an 1829 book that Charles Barnard wrote to talk about his time in the Falklands. Anyway, the men in the hunting party, they survived on their own from June 12th, 1813 until November 25th, 1814, a total of 534 days, most of the time living on New Island. They made clothes and shoes out of seal skins. They subsisted mainly on a diet of hogs, geese, seals, native plants, potatoes, which were planted by earlier mariners, and albatross and penguin eggs. Now, it's a good thing that in the early 1800s, nobody was worried about cholesterol, because they ate a lot of eggs. Oh, man. I have no idea what a penguin egg or an albatross egg tastes like, but it's probably pretty tasty. Anyway, they built a rudimentary hut out of sod, driftwood, sealskin, and the ribs of whales. I'm not sure why Charles Barnard is sort of skulking around behind the tussock grass there, but he looks kind of mysterious. Now, to cook and stay warm, they burned vines, driftwood, and the peat underlying the dense growths of the tussock grass. Now, as I said, tussock grass can grow for 200 years. It's sort of like some of the ornamental grass you probably have in your gardens. And it can get to be 9 feet tall, but beneath it, over decades and centuries, it builds up a very thick layer of high organic content peat, which can be burned much like coal. Now, during this long period, they got into a few fights. They had many adventures and misadventures, and they faced a lot of adversity. They went on numerous hunts with Charles Barnard's dog, Scent, leading the way. Here's a hunt of a sea lion, but the hunt where Scent really made his bones was in attacking hogs, because these hogs were very fast, and the men alone probably couldn't have captured them because they didn't have any gun. They had a gun, but they had no gunpowder or bullets, and the hogs can run very, very fast. So what Scent did is he would, on a command from Barnard, when they saw a hog, he would rush forward, grab their ear or somewhere around the shoulder or maybe their front leg, trying to stay away from the tusks and give the men just enough time to rush in and club the hog to death or stab it. So unfortunately, this is very dangerous duty for a dog. And at one point, Scent had his groin gored. Another time, he had a huge slash on his hindquarters, and then unfortunately for him, he had one of his eyes poked out. But even after all of these interactions with hogs that didn't end too well for Scent, he would recuperate and we'd go back into the fight. He was a very good dog indeed. Now, at one point, the other men abandoned Barnard. That's why this is Robinson Crusoe. This is from Defoe's book. Anyway, at one point, the other men abandoned Barnard without telling him why. They just took off. They took his dog, and they took almost everything else that he had, and they left him for 2 months, and he survived, a real Robinson Crusoe. And he was a religious man, so when they came back, he turned the other cheek, and he let them back into the fold. But later on, one of the men who was the fomenter of this departure of the four from Charles Barnard, he was a real piece of work, this British guy. He was so bad and he was so much of a bully that the other four men turned around and marooned him on another island until he behaved better. So this is, this is basically a story about human nature. Some things going wrong and going right. And it's just amazing what happens when you're under duress. But one of the men's most exciting and dangerous adventures was in the southwestern corner of New Island, where there was a cliff that was almost 200 feet tall, and at the bottom of the cliff were a bunch of seals that they wanted to kill. Because, despite what you may think, all the Falkland Islands aren't seals all over the place. They have certain places, and they tend to pick places that are hard for people to access over time, and this is one of them. Now, this engraving is a little bit faulty. The cliff did not bow in like that. I don't think they could have climbed down 200 feet of rope hanging like that. It actually went like that a little bit, sort of like the earlier cliff I showed you, so they could use their feet and their hands to go up and down. That rope is the exact kind of rope that Inuits and natives of North America and the Arctic used for centuries. They basically killed very large old sea lions. They stripped them of their skin, much like you peel an apple in one continual twirl, and then they'd ravel together 2 or 3 of the skins and let them dry for a number of days, and they dried into a sort of hard leather that was very could hold their weight, and that's how they went up and down. Now, the men's lonely and harsh existence on the Falkland Islands came to an end on November 25th, 1814, when the British whale ships, the Asp and the Indispensable, showed up at the Falklands. What's interesting is when Duranda and the other British got back to London, word got out about what had happened on the Falklands, and Duranda's reputation was in the gutter because most people agreed that what he had done was the wrong thing. So as a result, the Royal Navy sent out a circular to all their stations in the Pacific and the Atlantic saying, if anybody goes to the Falkland Islands, look for these 5 men from the hunting party and pick them up. Well, the captain of the Indispensable had read that circular, but he totally forgot about it. The reason that he was in the Falklands was just to stop at New Island to get water. And then he sees these men on the shore, and he suddenly puts 2 and 2 together. These are the missing hunting party. Now, the 2 ships departed the Falklands with the survivors on November 29th, 1814. Remember that date. That, in a very unusual coincidence, is the exact same date that thousands of miles away in London, the Prize Court of Appeals was determining who is the rightful owner of the Nanina. Now, the prize case appeared to be quite simple. Duranda submitted his side of the story, and there was nobody there to dispute him. So the court gave him the rights to the ship. But there was a year cooling off period. Basically, there was a year during which you could submit an appeal to this condemnation. So Duranda couldn't get his money yet. Now, after the Treaty of Ghent was signed and finally ratified in early 1815, the owner of the Nanina, John Murray and Sons, or John Murray, he could go to London and make his case to get the Nanina back. And he immediately went to London, arrived there in June. With the help of a local lawyer or barrister, Murray launched a legal attack. And as a result, the Advocate General of the Civil Court urged Murray to appeal instantly the condemnation of the Nanina, stating that there is reason to think that the capture ought not to have been made. Appeal Murray did, his barristers submitting the paperwork on November 28th, 1815. You remember the year cooling off period? That's a day before that period would have ended. So they made it in just under the wire. And then a few years later, on February 5th, 1818, the Prize Appeal Court of the High Court of the Admiralty ruled in favor of the Murrays. The Nanina and its cargo, they would be compensated completely for that, and Duranda was left with nothing, a fact that he continued to bemoan and complain about for the rest of his life. Now, Barnard's journey back to the United States took a couple of years. He's thousands of miles away. These British ships aren't going to stop their whaling voyage just because they picked up 5 people who were marooned on the Falkland Islands. So Barnard had to go around in the Pacific. He went whaling for a time. He went to Lima, Peru. He went to Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands. He went to Canton before he was finally able to find an American ship to take him back to the United States. Finally, at the end of October 1816, Charles had the unspeakable happiness, as he referred to it, of being back home in New York, where he reunited with his family and the owners of the Nina, who were astonished and delighted to see him alive. Now, this is an engraving, or painting really, of South Street Seaport in the early 1800s. I was in South Street Seaport about 3 weeks ago. I gave a talk on this book on a ship there. And I have to say, South Street Seaport does not look like this anymore. It cost me $6.50 for a latte, and I had sushi right overlooking the water. But I'm gonna make you guys in comparison are doing great because you have an open bar in the other room. When I spoke at the South Street Seaport, they also had wine, and I have to say, one of the women in attendance drank so much she got drunk and she had to be escorted. She was wobbling, walking off the ship. She barely made it off the ship. She didn't hear the rest of my talk. Halfway through the talk, she just was wandering around as I was talking. It was very interesting. I hope she's okay, but I'm glad none of you have really embarrassed yourself. Maybe afterwards you will. Anyway, the rest of Barnard's life was not particularly noteworthy and included stints as a warden of the port of New York and as a commander of a lightship, which is basically just a lighthouse on a ship off of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. After encouragement from his friends, he wrote this book in 1829 about his experiences in the Falklands, and he finally died on November 13th, 1863, at the age of 83. Now, few newspapers covered his passing, but one that did was the New York Herald, and it only gave him a single sentence obituary, and it didn't say anything about the most important event in his life, which was being left on the Falkland Islands. But before you feel too bad for him, another guy that you're probably very familiar with, Herman Melville, when he died in 1891, Harper's Weekly only gave him a one-sentence obituary too, because he died in obscurity. He wasn't famous at all as a writer. So I used to joke, there used to be a newspaper in my hometown of Marblehead that when I gave talks on that whaling book, I said, well, when I die, which hopefully won't be too soon, you better give me at least a paragraph in the local paper, in my obituary. So this is the Charles Barnard Museum on New Island. Now, you remember New Island is where a lot of the action takes place? It is now, the entire island is a nature preserve. And Georgina Strange, the woman who took the photographs for a lot of the photographs in this book, her father, Sir Ian Strange, bought the island and donated it so that it could be a nature preserve. And this museum is supposed to have a lot of fishing history in it, history about the Falklands, some stuff about the Barnard's experience, and it's right about where they think that he built his hut. Those are some whale bones. But there was somebody that came to my talk a couple of weeks ago who was in the Falklands this past February, and when I said, oh, this is a museum, he raised his hand and he said, no, it's not, it's a souvenir shop. And I said, okay, well then they pulled the wool over my eyes because I was sent 12 pictures of the inside of this building, some from the tourist office and some from the woman who was the manager of the island, the conservation manager, and it looked like a museum to me. So all I could figure is during the summer months, which is February would be, when tour groups come in, they push all the museum stuff to the side and they sell t-shirts. I have no idea. So anyway, that's the end of my talk, but I'm going to answer this one question that somebody asked me before that I always get asked in all the interviews I've done and my talks, so I'll just get it out of the way. No, I did not go to the Falkland Islands, and that was on purpose, in a sense, because I didn't think I had to go to the Falkland Islands to write them as a character in the book, because I had a lot of descriptions of the Falkland Islands in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I'm not writing about it as it is today. And to go to the Falklands is a pretty major trip, fairly expensive, and I just didn't feel justified in doing it. And I'm I'm happy to say that one of the people who blurbed my book, if you were watching the news this past summer, you know that Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, was discovered. Well, the head of that expedition was a guy named Menson Bound, who wrote a book about it. He grew up on New Island. He read my book. He actually read it right before he was going to the Antarctic. And he wrote me an email saying, you captured the Falklands beautifully. But I did say to the people on Falklands TV, who I spoke to about a week ago, I said, if this book does well enough, Jen and I will go to the Falklands. So you can contribute to that by buying a book. I'm not sure it's going to do that, but at least there's an incentive built in there. We'll see how it does after a year or two. But that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah. Well, a lot of times with the books, I come up with the idea because I'm working on a current book and something sparks my imagination. That didn't happen with this. I was looking around for a story. I knew I wanted to stay in the maritime realm. And there was a book that was written in the 1970s that is a compilation of shipwrecks and disasters at sea from 1580 to 1860. And it was done by an English professor, believe it or not. And all it does is it gives a paragraph or two description of each event. And I was flipping through it and I was saying, oh, I know that story, I know that story. For example, it had the ramming of the Essex, in the heart of the sea. That I think a lot of authors have gone through this book and gotten ideas. And then I finally came to this one description of this guy named Charles Barnard, an American sealing captain who went to the Falklands and ended up being marooned there for nearly 2 years. I said, that's interesting. And beneath it, it said he wrote a book. So Google Books is amazing. Boy, my whole research has changed. When I started writing books, I had to go to specialized libraries. I had to go to England, to the archives. Now, so much is online. Whatever you think about Google, if it's good or ill, Google Books has helped a lot of historians because in 10 seconds, I had this 1829 book in front of me and I read it and I said, this is a great story, but I don't know if there's enough material to write a book because you can't write a book just based on one person's recollection. So fortunately I found there were log books, there were other books that were written, there were a lot of newspaper articles, there was this protest, there was the legal case in England, and that's how I came up with the idea. So, yeah. Yeah.
How much time elapses between your idea to do something and a book being published?
Well, there are two. When I sign a contract, by the time I sign a contract, I've usually done a couple of months. I had to put together a proposal. Now, I've been writing for a fair amount of time. My initial proposals, to give you an example, Leviathan, which was my first book with a major publisher. I'd written 6 books before that, but nobody's ever heard of them. And Leviathan, my proposal was almost 100 pages long. It's a detailed, annotated outline of what I expected the book to be. But now that I've written a lot of books, and I also have been with one publisher, basically, Norton and Liveright, for all these books, they trust me. So now my proposals only have to be 15 or 20 pages long. So it took me a couple of months to put together the proposal. It was accepted. I signed the contract. From the time I signed the contract till I handed it in, was probably around 15 or 16 months. It was very fast for this book because it was a concentrated story. Some books have taken me longer. And then once you, this is the secret of publishing that a lot of people don't know, is once you hand in a book, the book doesn't come out for another year. There's, especially with Norton, because they have a lot of, they still do editing. A lot of big publishers, I hate to say, do not really do editing anymore. Your editor just focuses on acquiring a book. They don't have time to edit. At Norton, I have a main editor, I have a copy editor, and then I have a line editor. And in between each one of those, I get the book back, and I have to make decisions about whether I agree with the changes or not. So it takes a year from the time I hand it in for the book to come out. I'm working on another book now about another shipwreck. I figured I'd do one more shipwreck. And this is in the Pacific Ocean. 20 years later, it's a whale ship. A lot of people die. There's tattooing. The American Navy's involved. It's a very interesting story. But for that one, I went crazy on the proposal. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to convince myself. But my proposal was 32,000 words, which is almost a half to a third of the book already. So, and I'm working on that now. So. Yeah. Yeah, there were cows, there were horses on some of the other islands, but no, the Spanish had vacated a year before, and there was an abandoned Spanish town. And actually, when the men in the 17.5-foot boat went to that town, their hopes were raised because they saw in the distance buildings. They thought people were there, but when they got closer, it was quiet. It was a ghost town, and there was actually a letter hammered to a post from the King of Spain, basically saying, "This is all Spanish property. You're trespassing, blah, blah, blah." And but there was nobody there. But part of the reason for the Falklands War in the 1980s was because of this long history. And I talk about it in the book. The French, Spanish, and the English in the 1700s at various times towards the end established settlements and claimed the Falkland Islands. And then the French sold out their claim to the Spanish. And then the Spanish and the British both claimed it. And then there were a bunch of revolutions in South America, and Spain lost its empire, but Argentina still wanted the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas, as theirs. Britain claimed it as theirs. They started settling people there, and then we had the ultimate, the war. And to this day, I don't know if any Argentinian people have come to my talks. Certainly a lot of British people have. The Argentinians still believe that, and they have an argument to make, and I don't decide that argument in the book, that they should have the Falklands, but the British believe they should have the Falklands, and they in fact do have the Falklands because they possess it, and they fought that war for it. But it was funny when Rebels at Sea, I gave a talk once, and a guy afterwards, at the end of the talk, I mentioned that I was working on this book, and a guy comes up and he hands me his business card. He works for the U.S. State Department, and his purview is the Falkland Islands and some of South America. And he goes, are you going to decide in your book who has the rights to the Falklands? I said, you got to be kidding. That's not what the book is about. You think I want to start a shooting war in Marblehead? People coming after me? So it's the same reason in an earlier book, I didn't decide whether the U.S. Navy was founded in Beverly, Marblehead, Providence, Philadelphia, Whitehall, New York. I have a nice footnote about it, and really it depends on how you define it. And I have to tell you, with the Falklands, I'll leave it at that. It depends on how you define what ownership is, because the history is pretty murky. Who saw it first, who settled first is clear. The first people to actually settle on the Falklands the first people to come to have a settlement there were the British. But Spanish were, anyway. I'm not going to resolve it here. Yeah.
We lived in Marblehead for 40 years.
You lived where?
Marblehead.
Oh, great.
Well, we were in Buenos Aires, and a British cruise ship came into town.
Okay.
And British citizens could not come into Argentina if they already been in the Falklands.
Wow. Oh, I didn't know that.
They're very strict about it. They had to stay on board the ship.
Wow. Huh. So now you used to live in Marblehead, but you live here? You live here now? What happened? Why'd you leave Marblehead? you lose your mind? No. No, Barnstable looks lovely, like a lovely place. Most of New England would be a great place to live. Anyway. Okay. But that's interesting. I think there are a lot of sore feelings. I mean, people were killed over that, and it's very dramatic. I've been told by people who have been to the Falklands, and I've met a number of them, is that the people in the Falklands are just wonderfully hospitable. And I would love to go there someday, but I have to admit, it's not high on my bucket list. So, anyway, Titcombs did bring books, not only this one, but Rebels at Sea and one copy of my Lighthouse book. And I'm happy to sign them however you like. And you still have enough time, I think, I don't have my watch, but to go see the Celtics, and they better win.